Hello everyone, welcome back to ENVS 1800. This is lecture number 2. I hope that you're all doing well as can be in these current times that we all find ourselves in. In this lecture, I'm going to cover assignment 8, the final project, and in particular I want to review with you how to select the pieces that you'll include in your collection, how to decide on a theme or themes that unify them or bring them into conversation, and how to write your reflection, what's important to think about there. In this lecture, I really I want to emphasize how to, instead of looking at this as a mountain of new work that you'll be doing, I want to encourage you instead to view it as a way to recount the journey that you have taken in Environmental Studies 1800, and how through reading and writing you've come to perhaps a better understanding or a more personal relationship to this larger thing we call climate change. Instead of thinking of this as an overwhelming amount of work, I really encourage you to think of this more as an opportunity to take stock, think about what you've learned, and to share that with us. Throughout, I'll be reading some selections from Alexander Chee's How to Write an Autobiographical Novel, both the title essay and a few other selections. In particular, I want to highlight what she calls writing and this thinking, sort of a reflection about an exercise he calls, quote unquote, an exercise in giving a shit, especially during times of what we could call fearsome and pitiable events that we now find ourselves in. Let's start with the selection. One way to go about this is to look at all of your pieces and find the ones that most have something in common. And while that might be easy for some of you, perhaps there are some that this doesn't as easily come together. So I want to offer a few different ideas about how to select. Overall, I encourage you to choose those pieces that you liked the most, or maybe those pieces that actually have the most room to do a little bit of revision, which is the next thing I will talk about. But if we look at the assignments you've had, a strike report, a triptych of poetry, an elegy, a future fiction, performance poems, and the unsent letter, you could use the essay, but I encourage you to choose from assignments 1 to 6 because you won't have any feedback on the essay, and I think that's a bit cumbersome to include. But if we look at this, one easy thing that comes to mind could be that the strike report is about a present event that happened very recently. The future fiction is something that, by its very definition, looks at the future. And some of you, I know, in your unsent letter, for example, looked at things from the past, people that could no longer hear the words that you want to say today. A theme that readily emerges from that is climate change, past, present, and future. Have fun with it. The way in which your selection precipitates a unified theme or themes doesn't have to be because of the sameness. It could just be a way in which all of these pieces have something to say in relationship to each other, or maybe they provide different perspectives on the same issue. Maybe there are common themes about a particular place you constantly write about, or about particular kinds of different kinds of loss, specific issues of climate change. And again, maybe they provide different perspectives on an issue. Or again, you may have written one piece with anger, one piece through the elegy, again, more about sadness. Maybe another is about hope. So again, maybe it could be what unifies them is your focus on emotion. And one thing to note is that if you are choosing the triptych or the performance poetry pieces, remember that you need to include all 3 from the triptych and both from the performance poems. So you're not just choosing a smaller piece of each. I think one way to be open to this selection process is to think about what she says in terms of how he came to his novel. Again, this is a much smaller project than writing a novel. But when his friend offers him some perspective on a variety of story fragments, he reflects on this on page 205 and says, Hoffman's idea that day challenged me at first. I had been trying very hard to write stories, and I felt as if I had failed. The connections between the stories seemed at best remote to me, but over time I understood. She saw the way each of them had roots that connected to one another, and also the way I'd formed a narrative in my ordering of them. Even the enjambments between sections gave the reader the pause you feel as you understand a story is about to unfold. And when it didn't go further, it felt like a mistake. This vision of my own process, and the way it has informed what I do, and even how I teach, continues to this day. That day, when I asked my fragments to tell me what they were when we arrived in New York, before I got into my loaded car and drove there, I knew I was calling out to a novel. I knew these pieces had their own desire to be whole. And as I opened the binder that summer in New York and read through the fragments again, I could sense the shadow of something in the links possible between them, and began to write to the shape of it. Again, I know it's a different process, writing a novel, curating this small collection of your writing from the course, but I encourage you to be open to the possibility that the pieces that you've written may have something to say to each other now that you look at them as a group. Maybe there's more there than you saw before, so be open to that possibility and the creativity that might engender. Once you've chosen the pieces, I really encourage you to revise them. At the very minimum, you should really proofread the pieces and ensure that anything obvious has been cleared up, any obvious errors, any kind of misspelling, grammar, punctuation errors, that sort of thing, that the layout and the font is all standardized, that things look orderly and cleaned up. If you have the time and the interest, I also encourage you to really look at the pieces that you've chosen and look at the feedback you got on them from Alex, but also those who did a peer review with you, if you were in tutorial for that, and really consider the feedback you got. Was there anything that you could change that's not too difficult to do in order to really sharpen the piece? For those of you who have the time, maybe revisiting a piece and really improving it would be something that you really would like to do, to have, and now you have distance from it and you're able to give it that extra little oomph. But yeah, at the very minimum, do revise in order to make it more readable, more, punctuation, grammar, spelling, that's correct, etc. Again, once you've chosen the pieces and are thinking about how to choose them and you've decided on your three, again, read them and be open to the idea of the theme. And that might even be really influenced in the order that you place them in. What kind of a narrative comes out of these three pieces together? Why did you choose them? This is important because I want you to include this in your reflection. Part of the reflection should consider, which pieces did you choose? Why? What is it that they say as a group and individually that makes them stand out for you? And that they were important pieces in your writing practice that you developed over the course of the term. So then, the reflection. Once you have finished selecting and revising your pieces and have some idea of the theme or the story that connects them, this is where the reflection and introduction to the piece should start to come together, and this is really where I suggest you put the majority of your efforts. Ultimately, the reflection / introduction should do two things. First, it should tell the reader a story about what you've learned about reading and writing in relation to climate change throughout the course. Again, this doesn't have to be, a particular memory or that sort of thing, but just to tell us something about your relationship to reading and writing, how that may or may not have changed throughout the course, some things you're going to take with you from here as you go out, into your future studies. Second of all, it should tell the reader the story about your selection process, what connects your pieces, and why you chose them and how they speak to each other. Overall, I really encourage you to write the reflection in a way that is most helpful to you. This does not have to be a formal essay, so please feel free to be creative here. I think I mentioned in the assignment itself that it's absolutely permissible to write it as a, Dear Alex and David and Kate kind of piece. You're welcome to be creative and flexible in a way that allows the reflection to be something useful to you, particularly now that we're in this time that the coronavirus is really changing our relationships to one another. It's exposing all kinds of really profound inequalities in the world and how systems really are very fragile and being very strained. I think the reflection should or can very much include that sort of that awareness. What does reading and writing mean in this particular time that we live in? If you are struggling with this, I really suggest that you look at Alex's tutorial number 3, as it offers a variety of reading prompts to give you a sense both of how to start assignment 7, but also here about what are you feeling right now? How does that shape your relationship to reading and writing in the world? There's some great prompts there that I really think can help you start to generate what you might include in the reflection. Overall, this is a kind of chance to have your say. In the final chapter from Chi's book that we've read on page, I have just 1 second. I'm back. On page 253 in the essay on becoming an American writer, Chi talks about coming to his class after the election and says how he addresses the class and states, "I'm not going to pretend last night didn't happen," I said. "Let's just talk about whatever it is we need to talk about." "What is the point?" one of my most talented students asked after the shortest pause. "What is the point even of writing, if this can happen?" I think this is a good question for you to respond to in your reflection if you're looking for a place to start. What is the point? What have you learned about reading and writing that builds, accentuates, adds to our understanding and your personal relationship to what's going on in terms of climate change in the world? I think there are many points that we could address or look at, but what is the point for you? I think that's one way to look at this reflection. Because writing can be many things. It can be used to achieve any number of ends. It can be difficult as much as it can offer a really particular freedom of thought and expression. The important thing here is to tell us what your story of reading, writing in climate-changing times has been. In order to write this reflection, and especially if you are at a loss for where to begin with your own story, I suggest that you start from the core texts. One of the requirements of the assignment is to, choose 2 short quotations that help to illuminate or describe what it is you think that reading and writing can do. Again, I encourage you to pick pieces that really moved you or shaped your thinking, that helped you to read and write better, helped you learn who you were reading or writing for. And I have some selections I'd like to read to you. So what are some examples? What do I mean when I say draw from the text themselves? If we look at Elle Jones, Live from the African Resistance, there are many examples in which she really speaks powerfully about what she thinks reading and writing can do in a variety of different ways. The first example I'd like to offer is the performance poem Harriet on page 14. On page 15 specifically, Jones writes, "And I wish more women could listen and be inspired to do the same for our children. She dedicated herself to her decision to uplift her people. She never learned to read or write, but she could guide thousands by the light of the North Star. Meanwhile, my sisters with law degrees and PhDs, believing we have come so far, are brainwashed into thinking our life has no dignity, and so we do not seek for equality. My sisters, we should ask ourselves seriously why so many of us have our own house or bank account and car, but still do not value ourselves 0.5% as much as Harriet did. We need to ask ourselves why it is that we continue to accept being less than 3/5, not like Harriet, taking care of business. Sisters, please consider what I am telling you about her life, and refuse to participate any longer in your own degradation." I think it's interesting here that Jones is thinking about the power of a story of a woman who couldn't read and write, and yet Jones wants to write this down in order for it to be remembered. I think many of the writers in this course really were emphasizing the power and the importance of remembering, and how sometimes reading and writing or memorizing and speaking, I know many of you were actually very impressed and really learned a lot by what rhyme could achieve and how it could help you remember. Telling stories, often those that aren't heard or not known, is one of the most important things that reading and writing and the creation and sharing of storytelling can do. Another interesting poem that uses the conceit of thinking about parts of speech as metaphors and using them different ways to show how English language has been part of the process of oppression. It's actually called Parts of Speech. It begins on page 76, and I'm just going to read a small selection from the end of the poem on page 78. You make our youth into first drafts for the front line of the army, left illiterate by public schools who treat them like footnotes. And now you blame their problems on ebonics. But I can read you like a book. So I see through you like transparent paper. I have turned your language against you. So I guess you didn't get your copyright. I think it's funny, but also powerful. And again, this poem is speaking directly to the power of keeping a population illiterate and what that does. And again, the way in which Joan's writing is meant to be spoken, read aloud, and shared. I think there's an interesting relationship there that you might want to think on, or might be important to you as you're reflecting on what reading and writing can do. And finally, in the poem Toxic Legacy, which we spent quite a lot of time on page 115, I'm just going to read the first part to sort of remind you of the gist of it. There's a connection between the landfills and our peoples being killed, between environmental damage and our physical, spiritual, and mental damage. Whether from slavery, colonization, colored homes, or residential schools, and they think they can apologize and make it all better, just like they think they can recycle and make it all better. There's a relationship between continued pollution and their continued lack of solutions to racism and poverty, because the problems lie at the root of settler society. It's a toxic legacy. Again, Jones does an excellent job of connecting one, seemingly disparate, or how some people would like to think that these are disconnected, environmental degradation, environmental racism, and racism itself, and colonization, slavery, poverty, these sorts of things. Again, reading and writing and the sharing of our stories can be a really important way in which we learn how to make connections and insist that these are not disconnected, that we really have to attend to them. So I think that's some of the interesting contributions you could possibly take from Jones. Next, I'd like to look at Ocean Vuong's On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, and I'm just going to choose one page, and just to speak briefly that I know that there are several of you in the course that English is not your primary or first language. Some of you speak multiple languages, and your relationship to reading and writing is probably really interesting and complex, especially your relationship to reading and writing English. And on page 5, Vuong, through the narrator of Little Dog, reflects on this. That time, in 3rd grade, with the help of Mrs. Callahan, my ESL teacher, I read the first book that I loved, a children's book called Thunder Cake by Patricia Polacco. In the story, when a girl and her grandmother spot a storm brewing on the green horizon, instead of shuttering the windows or nailing boards on the doors, they set out to bake a cake. I was unmoored by this act, its precarious yet bold refusal of common sense. As Mrs. Callahan stood behind me, her mouth at my ear, I was pulled deeper into the current of language. The story unfurled, its storm rolled in as she spoke, then rolled in once more as I repeated the words. To bake a cake in the eye of a storm, to feed yourself sugar on the cusp of danger. A little further down the page. The time I tried to teach you to read the way Mrs. Callahan taught me, my lips to your ear, my hand on yours, the words moving underneath the shadows we made. But that act, a son teaching his mother, reversed our hierarchies, and with it our identities, which in this country were already tenuous and tethered. After the stutters and false starts, the sentences warped or locked in your throat. After the embarrassment of failure, you slammed the book shut. I don't need to read, you said, your expression crunched, and pushed away from the table. I can see. It's gotten me this far, hasn't it? I really think that Vuong does an excellent job in this book of letting us know about the process of writing, about why he would try to write to his mother, about letters that don't make it to the people that they're meant for, and I think gives us opportunities to think about when we write something, even if it doesn't reach those we intend it to reach, what is its power? I think all these writers are really curious and thoughtful and passionate about the power of writing, what it means to record a story that might not otherwise be heard, and how those, what sort of impact those stories make in the world. Again, I think there's a lot more in this novel, but I just thought that might be one hook for some of you. And while I know I have included this in the previous part, well, and I'm not going to reread the part from the previous lecture, but I've included the conclusion of On Becoming an American Writer in the previous lecture. I think, again, it's worth attending to Chi and the struggle he has with how to answer the question the student asks about what is the point. This is on page 276. I began this essay as an email I wrote to my students during that first weekend of the war in Iraq. I felt a sudden, intense protectiveness of them. I didn't want my students to go into the draft, rumored then to be a possibility, and I was even more afraid of people like the Secretary of Defense. Destroying art is practice for destroying people. I wanted to lead my students to another world, one where people value writing and art more than war. And yet I knew then, and I know now, that the only thing that matters is to make that world here. There is no other world. This is the only world we are in. This revisable country, so difficult to change, so easily changed. I wrote to them that weekend and told them that art endures past governments, countries, and emperors, and their would-be replacements. That art, even or perhaps especially, art that is dedicated somehow to tenderness, dedicated as a lover who would offer something to her beloved in the last nights they'll share before she leaves this life forever, is not weak. It is strength. I asked them to disregard the cultural war against the arts that has lasted most of their lives, the movement to discredit the arts and culture in American public life as being decorative interruptions of more serious affairs, unworthy of funding, or even of teachers. I told them that I can't recall the emperors of China as well as I can Mencius, who counseled them, and whose stories of them, shared in his poetry of these rulers and their problems, describe them for me almost entirely. And the paradox of how a novel, should it survive, protects what a missile can't. The email I sent was not the only act, though. It was just a beginning. It was when I turned my back on the idea that teaching writing means only teaching how to make sentences or stories. I needed to teach writing students to hold on, to themselves, to what matters to them, to the present, the past, the future, and to the country, and to do so with what they write. We won't know when the world will end, if it ever does. We will be better served, when it does, by having done this work we can do. So, I want to leave you there then. I think there's so much in all of these texts to help light your way in terms of what you have learned in the course, or what you might want to take with you. What will you put in your backpack as this world unfolds in these really challenging times? I hope you found something in the course that offers you, a talisman for protection, for tenderness, and for hope beyond the place and time we find ourselves in now. It's really been my great pleasure to be your teacher through the course, and I'm really looking forward to reading your reflections for this final assignment. As always, please do reach out to Alex and I anytime that you need a hand. We're here to help, and that's it for Lecture 2. I'm going to post one more short clip soon about the last tarot reading I did on March 13th, and I'll see you there. Take care and good luck with all your writing.